Hello, everybody. I am Young Penitent, and welcome to my Icon Corner. Today, I am pleased to bring on a guest, a priest from the Russian Church abroad, Father Sergei Sveshnikov, and we're going to be talking about fasting today. He has a blog which often covers subjects of fasting. It's an interest of his, apparently. So I'm going to add him to the stage here. And welcome to the channel.
Thank you.
How are you doing?
Good, thank you.
Okay, so first, before we get to the subject of the interview, I would like you to, if you could, just give it an introduction to the audience, introduce yourself, who you are,
Well, so it probably is less relevant as to who precisely I am. I've been a priest for over 20 years. I've served in many different parishes around the country. That's not maybe the most interesting thing or the most important thing, but what I think is more relevant is I've been very interested in the subject of fasting, not just fasting, also prayer, for a number of years now, for a peculiar reason, but that's so I've been trying to explore this the subject, fasting and prayer and other things that are less academic, less theological, so to speak, and maybe more practical, in my personal blog and also in my personal life. And so
I would like.
That's as good as an introduction as there is.
Yeah, that's great. So I have met you in person. You now are serving in where do you serve now?
Well, actually, I've been working as a chaplain for a number of years, and so I live in upstate New York, and so I do not have a parish right now. I've been working as a chaplain for Federal Bureau of Prisons.
Oh, that's interesting. And you also were in the military, right?
At some point, a long time ago. Yes.
A long time ago. And so I actually met you. You were serving a parish local around where I am. I met you when you were at Milano. So that's how I found out. That's how I knew you.
That was many years ago. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. I used to live in Oregon. Yes.
And then you moved to Texas, and I guess you've kind of bounced around a little bit.
Texas, Puerto Rico, Wisconsin, upstate New York. That's right. Yes.
Oh, okay, so you're actually on Eastern time then. I thought you were when I was setting this up, I was assuming you were on Central time.
No.
Okay.
New York, upstate New York.
Okay, sorry for the mix-up.
That's okay.
So, and you have an education, right? A theological education, I believe. You have some sort of degree or something, right?
I do, but the reason you hesitate is probably because, well, the very reason I don't advertise it is I don't find it to be the most helpful thing in orthodoxy. I've certainly dabbled in it. I do have an education. I have a couple master's degrees and a few graduate certificates, but I have not found that to be the most helpful thing in an orthodox worldview. Let's just put it that way. And so that's why I do not typically just advertise this, and that's why you will not find it on my page on my on
right. Okay, I see. Yeah. Interesting. Okay, so I have been following you. And one more question. You are where are you from? You do have a bit of an accent.
Well, I mean, was born in Russia,
Okay.
but by now I've lived more than half my life in the United States. So the question as to where I'm from is a bit tricky in that sense, because, well, I was born in Russia, but I've been here in the U.S.
Okay.
A bit more than half my life.
All right. So I've been following you on your blog, and I'm going to show the blog here to the stage. So this is.
Oh yes, that's the latest post that came out, the mushroom post. Yeah,
yes, this is interesting. So this is his blog, Sergei Sveshnikov.substack.com. It's called Phroneo. And what does Phroneo mean?
Well, it's a Greek word which basically means I think. I think. You know, there are many different ways of interpret that particular word, but the one that I actually like is I think, and so that's why I named it that. Is I think, yes.
Okay.
The things I think.
And so I actually subscribe to this blog, and because I don't know, for some reason I'm also interested in fasting. I mean, you talk about other topics than fasting here. But like, I mean, it's very interesting. Like this week, or last week during Clean Week, you were going over some of the source material, some of the old ancient documents where our fasting rules are derived from. And we're going to talk about that. That's the subject of our interview today. But I just wanted to, give I wanted to show this to people in case they wanted to go to Substack and follow you. And I will put a link in the description below for people if they want to go check it out. But I do want to say that I find this blog to be very interesting. You write with wit, humor, and just a good, I don't know, you just kind of have you seem to be, what you're talking about is what the idea that I get here. And this is the only blog. This is like the only Substack that I have actually ever paid for. I'm a subscriber to this, and I never pay for like people's content. I usually only do free content, so that's a high praise there that I actually pay for this to see.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That's something that I also point out to people I talk to. It's like I would never pay to read someone else's writing. I'm not sure why people pay to read mine, but of course, I'm most thankful that you do.
I think it's worth it. I mean, it's like $5 and a month, and I delight in your writing. I think it's good. So that's my advertisement for your blog. And
thank you.
So now we can start the meat of the interview, the no pun intended. I want to know, first off, how did you get interested in this particular subject of fasting? Why did you kind of hone in on it?
Right. So there are a couple reasons, or maybe a couple ways to approach this. And one of the ways is, like I said before, I've dabbled in theology quite a bit. I think quite a bit for my personal taste. What I've discovered is that it's easy enough to talk about lofty things. It's easy to talk about things that are beyond our comprehension. I've encountered things in my studies that are outright inappropriate, like the discussions, voluminous discussions on the ever virginity of the Most Holy Theotokos. and people, people write about it, people talk about it, people discuss this kind of stuff. And then when you step back and you just like, what is going on here? What are these people even doing? Um, is this even appropriate? Well, clearly, to my mind, it's not. Um, but more to the point is people who talk about things that are very lofty, that are very complicated, that are very difficult, and that includes myself. And this is what I've again. I'm only reflecting on my own experience here. Is I can talk about many things that are very, very incomprehensible. Let's just put it that way. And then when the first week of Lent comes along, and we have day one and day two and day three, and then what we discover is that we cannot actually talk about high-flown, complicated things when it comes to hunger. This is where things get very simple and very direct. Okay, so you haven't had anything to eat in 5 hours. Now what? You still want to talk about the ever virginity of the Most Holy Theotokos? Do you still really want to talk about the Trinitarian mysteries and how many, the most difficult things you can possibly ever imagine in philosophy, in theology, and all these other things, and then 5 hours into a fast, day one of week one, and we break down. We're like, oh well, you know what? Well, maybe I'm just not ready. Maybe not this time. Maybe I'm just not quite ready. Maybe I can have something, right? Maybe I can have something to eat. Maybe. And it just, our brain just begins to come up with all these weird rationalizations. Why? Yes, the fathers did it, the saints did it, the church does it, but not me, not this time, not now, not today. And this to me was the most fascinating thing ever. And I thought, well, okay, if for no other reason, psychologically, this has to be studied. What are we doing? What is going on here? But even beyond that, so psychology maybe isn't my strongest point. Theologically, okay, what is going on? What are we doing? What is the point of all of this? And so I decided, well, if I'm going to spend my time, which is limited, to study anything, to learn anything at all, it has to be something that actually matters to me. And what matters to me at least at this stage of my life, is, okay, well, what is going on? Why are we breaking down? Why can't we say, okay, well, I'll give you another example. Maybe that's more to the point. So we now, during Lent, we have this practice of having pre-sanctified liturgies. And of course, everybody knows, well, everybody who's interested enough to learn this, that the pre-sanctified liturgy is to be served in the evening. It's a vesperal liturgy, so we start with vespers. Let us complete our evening prayer unto the Lord. Right? Vespers begins sometime around, well, let's just call it like 4 p.m., 3 p.m., 4 p.m. Some of it, because it's Roman time, it depends on what time calculate based on the solar hours, but let's just say approximately 3 p.m., 4 p.m., 5 p.m. Sometimes even 6 p.m. So, okay, um, this is the history, this is the tradition, this is what we do, and yet we don't. Everywhere you go in the United States, in Orthodox uh, world in the United States, you've discovered two things. One is that this particular vesperal liturgy is served in the morning, and two is it served in the evening, but the Eucharistic fast is of a peculiar nature. And so when it's served in the morning, the understanding is, well, it is because we do not want to fast until the evening, so we will serve it in the morning. When it's served in the evening, the idea is, well, so we don't want to fast until the evening, and so what we do, and there's believe it or not, there's an actual episcopal hierarchical decision to this particular issue, is, well, we will have breakfast, and then we will have lunch, and then we will fast from lunch time until communion time, and we will call that our fast. We will call that our Eucharistic fast. Well, I think you can probably see where I'm going with that, is that, well, if you've had breakfast and you've had lunch, and then you have communion, and then you still have supper after that, what precisely have you fasted from? Is it tea and cookies? Is it snacks? Is it, I don't know. What is it that you've fasted from lunch to communion? And so if fasting is important, well, then what's the importance? If it's not important, well, then why is it not important to you while it was important to the fathers of the church and the early Christians who have fasted clearly and put importance into it? And so that's roughly, the line of thinking that affected my maybe my interest in fasting and in other what would you call it, ways of expressing our faith that are not purely just brainy and rational, but are more visceral.
So it sounds like you just developed a genuine interest in these things, in these ideas. What's going on here?
I hope so. I hope it's a genuine interest. Like I said, it's I've done enough dabbling in theology to maybe know for myself that it's sort of pointless until you bring it into some sort of a bodily expression.
I do wonder if some of this interest in discussing theology is more of a young man's kind of pursuit, where when you're kind of younger and full of passion or energy or something like that. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, I would absolutely agree with that. Of course, my example is just one singular example of this, and so I don't want to, make it too broad. But that said, yes, when I was younger, I was more interested in more brainy things,
Right.
rational things that I can approach with my mind. Now that I'm getting older, I'm nearly half a century old. It makes more sense to me to ask a different question. Okay, well, how do I actually put it into a more embodied approach. And yes, no, you are absolutely right.
Okay, so you've developed this interest in fasting, and you have it appears to be you've been from reading your blog. It appears that you go and you read you're reading history, you're reading source materials. Do you have other people that you have discussions with that also study this kind of stuff, or is this kind of a solo?
No, yes, I do want to get information from other people who are actually practicing fasting. What I've encountered, however, is a peculiar problem is in Orthodoxy, we do not like to talk about our own private approach to things. And so what happens is I know someone who, let's just say, practices fasting very strictly, and yet this person will never talk to me, certainly
Mm.
not on record, about that particular experience.
Mm.
We can talk privately, but not publicly. And that goes even let's just say for
Right.
my own self. Like if you were to ask me right now, well, so what did you do in the first week of Lent? I would have a hard time telling you, well, this is precisely what I did. Not because I don't know what I did. I certainly know what I did. Because it's a bit of a strange concept in our current public orthodoxy. Is like, well, is this something I should actually publicize? Is this something I should just tell people, what I did, what I didn't do, and how it worked, how it didn't work, and how it felt? It's very difficult to yes, you're right on. It's a difficult thing to figure out
Right.
what it is that is appropriate in that sense. Now, I have to say that I've tackled this question some time ago, maybe a few years ago, and I've decided for myself that okay, well, I personally have nothing to brag about, and so I'm not really worried about it. And so, what I would like to do is, at the very least, share my own personal experience. Okay, well, this is what I tried. This is what it felt like. This is what worked, and this is what didn't work, without worrying that people are going to think that, oh, well, I'm just being inappropriate. You know, well, maybe I am, but that's okay. If of all the possible Orthodox people on this planet, I am the only one being inappropriate, well, that's just fine. I will tackle that.
Okay, so yeah, you have discussed that I think some of your fasting practices before in some of your writings, and it's a little more strict than I tend to be, honestly. So we have right now, as we're recording, we're in the second week of Great Lent, and like I am personally failing at. I don't fast as strictly as I used to. I'll just say that I kind of fail to uphold the fast strictly. We have these rules. We have our fasting calendar. We have 4 great fasting periods of the year, and I'm kind of curious about the history of these fasting periods. So if we can go back in time, I hope you can answer these questions. Maybe to the beginning of the church, or even further, if you are able to answer the question, like what was the fasting practices of the church of old Israel, before Christ came? Did they have specific fasting practices in the Old Testament period?
Well, so the answer is yes and no. For a very simple reason, maybe, is the fasting. So fasting in and of itself is as ancient as anyone can ever possibly imagine. It's been around all the way in the Old Testament and pre-Old Testament, and if one is into studying, evolutionary psychology and maybe anthropology, we discover that people have been fasting for a very, very, very long time in every possible religious circumstance, and completely unrelated to Christianity or Judaism. Ancient Romans fasted, ancient Greeks fasted, Vikings fasted, pagans fasted, of every possible type and creed. So the history of fasting, basically is the same as the history of humanity. Is the easiest way to say it. Now, that said, the way people fasted was different and continued to be different and changed depending on various circumstances, various maybe beliefs, I guess is one way to say it. So, for example, we are in the middle of Great Lent right now, and we see Great Lent as 49 days, essentially, of fasting. Well, there are two main problems with that approach, with what I just said. One is, I said it's 49 days of fasting. Well, when I use the word fasting, we sort of understand what I just said, but on the other hand, that word can have so many different meanings that, well, maybe it's not 49 days of fasting. We use the word. Well, I'll give you a simple example. I suppose is we say, well, I fast for Lent, and if you're a Roman Catholic, you might mean that you give up chocolate. Okay, well, so you just said you fast for Lent, but all you do is you give up chocolate. That is a form of fasting, I suppose. If you're an Orthodox person, you might mean that you do not eat animal products. Let's just say you don't eat meat or eggs or animal fats, butter, whatever. Well, okay, that's another way to describe fasting, is to say, okay, well, it's not just chocolate, it's also meat and eggs and maybe butter. Okay, fine. But if you're St. Anthony the Great, maybe what you mean is you don't eat anything at all. And you're not even talking about meat or butter. You're talking about food, period. And maybe you're even talking about water. Because when we read about fasting in one of the favorite books for Great Lent, let's just say The Ladder of Divine Ascent by John Climacus, what we discover is that when the fathers talk about fasting, they're not talking about meat. They're not talking about eggs. They're not talking about butter. Well, what they're talking about is, well, they simply don't eat. And even more than that, they don't drink either. So can you go without food for 40 days? Well, absolutely. Easily, many people have done that. Can you go without water for a couple days? Yes, that's going to be extremely difficult. And you will probably suffer. You will really, really suffer. And when you suffer, you will have to figure out what to do about that suffering. And so the word to fast can mean so many different things in different contexts, that to say, well, what is the history of fasting? Again, it could be as simple as in the Old Testament, well, people fasted for various reasons for a day or two, or it could be, well, now we fast for 2 months straight, and that's just kind of what we do as Orthodox Christians. and those two things don't mean the same at all.
All right. But were there like prescriptions like we have today? Did they have, I mean, only eat unleavened bread for, before the Passover or something like that? Were there?
Yes, of course. But that, for the most part, that was not related to fasting at all. So, for most of human history, and again, I have to say human instead of Christian because fasting is not a Christian invention. It's a human. It's a human concept. For most of human history, when we talk about fasting, what we talk about is abstinence from all food.
Right.
And what that means is, for an early Christian in the first, second century, if you say, I'm fasting, what you mean is, I don't eat.
Right.
And when you say, I broke the fast, you do not mean that you had a few pieces of feta cheese on your Greek salad. That's not what you mean. What you mean is you had a piece of bread, or maybe you had a drink of water,
Right.
and that is the breaking of the fast.
Okay.
So very often, what we discover is especially in connection with liturgics, is the act of partaking of the blood and body of Christ. That is to say, a little bit of bread and wine is the breaking of the fast. So right now, we would probably not consider it to be the breaking of the fast in modern Orthodox context. If you have a piece of bread, well, that's not in any way breaking of the fast, and yet it is in the liturgical context. Breaking the fast is, if you have received communion, you have now broken your fast.
Okay.
And so we see this in typical when it comes to the instructions for the liturgies of the presanctified gifts, and for liturgies in general. And the basic premise is that if you receive communion, you have now broken fast. And again, we also think about, okay, well, some days we can't have oil and we can't have wine. It's a complicated question, but the basic premise is, yes, wine is not an animal product. It's grapes. It's grapes. Depending on how you make it, it could just purely be grapes and grape juice. It could be grapes and water. But the problem is not so much animals. It's not animal products. It's not animal fats. It's not animal proteins. It's really not any of those. It's, you're either fasting or you're not. And so if you're fasting, you're not eating anything. And if you're not fasting, then anything at all you eat, may it be bread or wine or water or whatever, that breaks the fast. And so, again, historically, that's what we're actually talking about.
Okay.
When it comes to modern practice, we're talking about, modern, 21st century American Orthodox who think that maybe a rice ice cream or a tofu cake is still Lenten somehow, or is still fasting. It becomes a very difficult conversation, a different type of a conversation to say, well, no, neither one is Lenten, neither one's fasting. You're not fasting in the first place if you're eating cake, no matter what the cake has as its ingredient. So it's a very different historical conversation to have, as opposed to when you look at the Old Testament, and like Moses fasted and Elijah fasted and Christ fasted in the New Testament. So you just like, okay, what did Christ do in the wilderness? Did he have coffee without creamer and tofu, or what? Well, we understand what he did. He had nothing, and yet we somehow ignore it, and that's
Did
that's
he have
unfortunate.
water? Did he have water even, or was it an absolute fast?
Well, that's a very good question. So, if we are to understand it directly, no, he did not have water, because in that particular context, to fast meant to have neither food nor water, something akin to Ramadan. So right now, I think it is right now. I'm not really certain, but I think it's right around this time of year. Muslims have Ramadan, and so when they fast for Ramadan, they have neither food nor water until sunset. And so for early Christians, fasting meant just that: no food, no water, at the very least until sunset. In fact, the echo of this is still found in the Typicons and the various rules. So when you read the Typicon, it says, we fast until vespers. What that means is, yes, that's right. No food, no water, nothing. When you have water, you've broken the fast. You have now broken the fast. So when the Gospels talk about Christ fasting, and if you have to then kind of reflect, okay, well, so the people who read the text or who heard the text being read to them, how would they have understood it? And it appears to be that the way they would have understood it is exactly in that sense, is Christ had no food and no water. And that is the definition of fasting. Now, do I personally know what he did? No, I don't, obviously. I don't know what he did. I would have to assume that the word means what it meant to the people who maybe read it or heard it in the first century. And that probably means no food and no water.
Okay.
At the very least, what we can say, what we can guess is it's no food. Why? Well, because the scripture says that Christ fasted for 40 days and then he became hungry. Well, if you assume that he was eating tofu and shrimp and oatmeal, you would then have to say, well, why in the world was he in the end hungry? So at the very least, what we can assume is that he probably did not have any food. Now,
Okay.
did he also not have any water for 40 days? I have no idea. I don't think anybody does. The assumption is that is in fact the case.
Okay.
Historically, and by the way that we can interpret the meaning of the word fasting in that particular context. Yeah. Do we know? No, we don't.
All right. So yeah, this is kind of interesting because you're talking about fat. You've drawn this distinction in your blog before, the difference between fasting and actually you say what we do now is dieting. And I think
That's right.
This is interesting because like let's say I'm talking to somebody, a friend or acquaintance, and I'm saying, oh, I'm fasting, and they say, oh, you're fasting, but you're eating. I don't get it. So people, when you say fasting, they people who aren't Orthodox, they kind of think what you're talking about is not eating anything, And
That's right. That's right.
You
because
kind of
the human experience.
Yeah.
The people who are not Orthodox are actually more they understand it better. They understand it better than we do, because what we have done is we have turned into Pharisees, honestly. And this is, I mean, I don't, I do not mean to offend anybody. I certainly don't mean to somehow portray myself as being, such a faster, and I'm, my goodness, I'm such a holy man who eats nothing, drinks nothing, and he prays for 25 hours a day. No, absolutely not. But that said, you are spot on, because you talk to anybody, just an average American who is not even Christian, and they will know exactly what you mean when you say fasting. And when you tell them what we Orthodox do, they'll be like, "My goodness, that's not even fasting. That's some weird nonsense. That's like some kind of a diet. I don't know what you're doing, but that's not fasting.
Do you
That's
want
not
to?
what I thought. Yeah, that's not what I thought."
Yeah. Do you want to explain that concept you had about dieting? Or what we do is actually.
Well, yes, yes. Again, this game. So it's in stages. The stage one is, I was, as you mentioned, I was very young back many years ago, um, and so I thought, okay, well, what exactly is this fasting about? And so what you do is you look up what your church does, and what the church does is basically summed up in a like a church calendar. So you have a church calendar that says, okay, well, today we eat food without oil, and tomorrow we eat food with oil and wine or whatever. And it's like, okay, well, fine. So how does that even work? Okay, well, food without oil. Well, what is food without oil? Well, it's maybe bread and some potatoes and pickles and whatever. I don't know. It's you start kind of then breaking that into more specific concepts, and then you start looking at, like, okay, well, so tomorrow we have food with oil and wine. Well, so okay, so how much oil? So what is it? What is food with oil? Is fried potatoes food with oil, or is it boiled potatoes with a little bit of oil drizzled over the top? Like, what exactly is it? Right? Doesn't matter. That's the first question to ask. Well, does it matter? Because if it doesn't matter, then the rest of the questions should not even be asked. But if it matters, okay, well, why don't we just talk about it? Because, well, is it, so is it fried potatoes? How much oil? Is it a cup? Is it like 2 cups of oil? I mean, that's a lot of oil. Um, Wine. So we can have wine. So how much wine? How much are we talking about? Is it a cup of wine? Is it 2 cups of wine? Is it a bottle? Is it a gallon? Right. So that's the kind of thing that maybe a lot of people don't really bother with. My brain immediately went to that. Okay, so what exactly are we talking about? How much oil? I want to know. I want to know. I want to know what it says. And when I asked myself that question, it was like, okay, well, I want to know what it says. Well, what is it? Well, it has to be it's somewhere in the rules, right? So I started looking that up. Okay, well, this is what it says. This is precisely what it says. This is how much oil. This is how much wine. This is how many cups. This is how many milligrams.
Oh.
Whatever.
So so you looked it up. Can I break in? You looked it up. You're talking about the source material, like where these rules derive from, right?
That's right. That's right. Yes, yes. I wanted to know. I wanted to know, like, okay, so where does all of this come from? And what does it actually say?
Could you actually, what were those sources? Where do our fasting rules come from?
Well, so here's I will try to summarize, because it's a very complicated thing. Not because it's complicated in the sense it's incomprehensible. It's just it has many parts, many pieces. So it's a complex thing. In a nutshell, what happens is we have 2 traditions. One tradition is well, let's call it the Slavic tradition, maybe the Russian tradition, the Bulgarian, the Ukrainian, and that tradition appears to take what is essentially a rule for of the monastery. It's a monastery in Palestine. It's near Jerusalem, Saint Sabas monastery. That has a rule, and this particular rule was then taken up and maybe reworked a little bit, not really very much, but a little bit. It was reworked and then used as the rule for the entire church. So in Russia, for example, right now, and also in Rokor, this is the rule. Primarily, what we're talking about is the way to conduct services. So, for example, if you were to say, okay, so what are we doing on Saturday evening, right? You would say, okay, on Saturday evening in the Russian church, what we're doing is the all-night vigil. How do we do that? Well, here's step 1, step 2, step 3, and so on. And here's essentially the breakdown of the all-night vigil.
This is the Typicon, right?
Right. So that's what we do. Now, that's not the only rule. So again, this is a monastic rule. Mm-hmm. So it's important to remember that what we're talking about is the rule of a monastery in Palestine. It was then taken up and broken down into parish practice, but for the most part, what we're talking about is a rule for a monastery in Palestine. It is not a rule for a parish in Oregon or in upstate New York or anywhere else. This is why what you then end up having is aberrations, deviations from that rule. Is well, a parish in Oregon may not necessarily follow that exact rule. Well, I would have to say no parish would ever follow that exact rule. Is it a bad thing? Well, no, it not necessarily. It could be, and I will maybe get to that. For the most part, what we have to deal with is, okay, so we have a monastic rule, and we have to adapt it to various circumstances. There is another tradition. The other tradition is, let's call it Byzantine, because it's not exactly Greek. And in a Byzantine tradition, there is a rule that isn't a monastic rule, that is, let's just call it, they call it the Great Church rule. The Great Church, of course, is the Hagia Sophia, the Holy Wisdom Church in Constantinople. Now, the Great Church rule is a very specific slice in history. It is very unique. It is very specific, and it has never been really applied anywhere except for maybe the Great Church in the 4th century. So what we now understand as the Great Church rule was not actually the Great Church rule ever, at least not at the Great Church. So what happened is there was a way that Greek parishes were interpreting the rules and conducting services, let's just call it in the 19th century. And then that was codified, and that was called, okay, we will then describe that as the Great Church rule. Again, the Great Church has very little to do with it. The Byzantine history has very little to do with it. It's mostly, let's just say, the Greek parishes actually, their lived experience in the 19th century became codified as the Great Church rule. And so there's this, what we now understand here in the United States as the Greek tradition. So, for example, we know in the Greek parishes that on a typical Saturday there is no service at all, and then on Sunday morning there is what they call an orthros, which is essentially a matins service. And I've attended a number of them, and in my experience, very few people ever show up until it's time for the liturgy. So the priest is there, maybe one or two choir members chanting the orthros, the matins service, and then the liturgy begins. So that is not like a some sort of a deviation from the typicon that we know. What that is what they call the Great Church Rule. Again, very little to do with the Great Church itself, and more to do with the 19th century Greek parish practice. But that is yet one more tradition, and then there are also others. But for us, in a nutshell, those are the two main traditions. So we have the Slavic tradition, and then we have the Greek tradition. So between those two traditions, and like I said, most of the differences, or most of the issues with these rules have to do with the services, the liturgical services, and yet it is in those, somewhere in the body of the liturgical services, that we also have to then recognize the fasting practice, because it is then described in the Slavic typicon. Again, it's not a Slavic typicon; it's a Palestinian typicon. But in the Palestinian typicon, we have a couple chapters that have to do with a large number of chapters that have to do with services. We have a couple chapters that have to do with specifically fasting, and it's again in the Studite typicon and various other typicons. It's the same pattern. So most of the typicon has to do with actual services, and then the very little piece of it has to do with fasting. And it's the same with the Greeks. So they have their own idea of fasting. And again, yes.
I'm going to bring up one of your blog articles. Let's just go for just to illustrate what you're talking about. For example, Monday, you wrote about, you have here the different fasting rules, just so people can see.
Oh, yes.
Here, Jerusalem typicon, no food. Studite typicon, Mount Athos rule, Solovki. So there's different, and you explain it all below. So these are different monastic rules that have been written down, and so I just wanted to show that to illustrate what you're talking about.
Yes. That's right. So the important thing here to remember is these are monastic rules. So the one rule I did not put in there is the Great Church Rule, the Greek rule, right? There's a reason I don't want to deal with that. Primarily is because it's not my tradition, so I don't want to misrepresent it. I don't really want to, because it is a lived tradition. It is an actively lived tradition. There are people in the United States today, Greeks, who practice that, and I don't want to misrepresent it. I don't really want to get into those specifics without maybe a little more research. But all the other ones, yes, you're absolutely right. So these are not maybe sometimes we have a hard time comprehending it, the way it's presented to us typically. But these are not traditions for laity, except for maybe a couple of them. These are monastic traditions. So the Jerusalem typicon is not the typicon. It's not the Moscow typicon or St. Petersburg typicon or any of that kind of stuff. It's the typicon of the monastery of Saint Sabas near Jerusalem from the 5th century in Palestine. I mean, it's a very um, again, like back to your question. What was it that made me so interested in that? Is precisely that. But wait a second. Well, what does it mean to me? So Saint Sabas in the 5th century said that this is how the monks in his monastery should live. Well, what does that mean to me? Well, to me, that was a very, very important question to answer. And so that's what I've been trying to do this whole time, is to answer that very question. What does that mean to me?
Okay, so these documents are, you said, I think, from the 5th century. I'm kind of curious. Let's see, about maybe. Let's go back earlier before these rules were encoded and written down. I mean, we didn't have, from my understanding, for example, the first century of the church, there was no standardized practice. For example, for fasting for Pascha, there was probably a few different practices, and then it was at first they didn't have 4 fasting periods of the year yet. They would just fast, a week before Pascha or something like that. Or how did this all develop?
So you're absolutely right. There were no codified periods of fasting. Now, that said, you have to also recognize there still aren't. So 2,000 years later, our traditions are not uniform.
Okay.
You could make an argument that by now we have this codified Jerusalem typicon, Palestinian typicon tradition that says exactly what we're supposed to do, and yet you will recognize, based on what I just put out in the first week of Lent on my blog, that, well, you personally didn't follow that, and it's not just you. You can talk to other Orthodox people and say, well, did you do that? Did you do exactly what the Typicon said? Did you follow the rule? And you will immediately recognize that no, they didn't. So you have different traditions that have to do with. So, for example, you may have a parish tradition. Let's just say your parish in Oregon may promote a specific tradition that says, okay, well, this is what we do, right? We as a parish. And then you may have, if you're lucky, I'm not so lucky, but if you are lucky, you may have a family tradition where your parents tell you, okay, we as your parents, this is what we have done. This is how we have done it. And this is what we can tell you. This is what works. This is what doesn't. This is how it's going to feel, right? We've tried it, and this is what it feels like. Somebody asked me earlier today, because we were talking about fasting for the first week of Lent, and he said, "Well, what did that feel like?" And I thought, well, this is the most appropriate question. What did that feel like? Because when you're a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, you want to know, and your parents are going to tell you. Now, again, unfortunately, it is what it is. But I did not grow up in an Orthodox family, and my parents could not tell me what it feels like to fast for the first week of Lent. And so I had to kind of experiment and discover some of the things on my own. But that's a family tradition, right? So you may have one family that does things one way and another family that does things a different way, and each family has their own tradition. And so again, so when we're talking about, okay, well, so what is the rule for fasting? What exactly does the Typicon say? What do all these monastic rules say? We have to recognize that unless you are a monk that is assigned to that specific monastery, your idea of what fasting rules are should not be, well, this is what this specific monastic rule says, and this is what I'm supposed to follow. No, what you can try. In fact, I mean, sure, it's a good rule to try to follow because, well, why not? You can at the very least you can be guaranteed that some people have tried and they have done just fine with it, right? At the very least, you could say, okay, well, so a bunch of monks in Palestine for centuries have tried this, and now, I could also give it a try. But absolutely, it is not something you look at and say, well, this is what I must do, or else what? Well, or else nothing. Um, as non-monastics, we are not bound by the same monastic rules. We're just not. We can be given those rules as an example, but it's again, maybe that's a separate question to explore, is to what degree these monastic rules actually apply to people who are not monks. Because again, when we talk about like the Typicon, primarily what we talk about is liturgics, not fasting.
Right.
So when it comes to liturgics, okay, so we have a rule of how to do an all-night vigil in the evening on Saturday evening. So what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to ignore the rules, follow the rules? Is it important to follow the rules? Is it okay if we cut some things? These are the primary questions that are asked. Not so much fasting. 99% 99% of the Typicon has to do with liturgics. It does not have to do with fasting.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, I guess typically what we think of as fasting, well, we kind of went over this, but what is practiced is generally the priest will just say, don't eat these kind of foods. And I guess that I would say there's value in, I mean, even eating like a vegan diet is kind of makes you kind of tired and not as much energy, and it's kind of humbling, I guess. You don't get all that strength that you get from eating meat. So I guess
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure I can agree with that. No. I'm not sure I can. There are plenty of people who are vegans or vegetarians who do not eat meat. They seem to live their life just fine. A lot of them are, I don't know, of a different religion, if a religion at all. Some of them are non-religious, maybe atheist, and they have, like no connection to any religion. And they seem to be just fine. There are Indians, I assume, in India. I mean, I'm not sure. I've never been to India, but I have to assume that if taken at their face value, there are some Indians who do not eat meat at all. Maybe they eat some butter and maybe milk or whatever, but they're vegans or vegetarians. They seem to have a civilization that thrives, for better or worse. There are some issues that sometimes you hear about in the news, but then again, you can't always trust the news. So Indians in India have been around for thousands of years, and they seem to be doing just fine.
So what is the value then? What is the value then of following our priest's prescription if he just tells us don't eat these foods?
Well, and again, I think you're asking the most profound questions, and this is one of them. So your priest tells you something. Well, what's the value of doing what your priest says? Right. I think that's a very important question. So if your priest is a man who is very skilled at fasting, at, let's just call it, ascetics, because that's probably more to the point. It's a man who's an ascetic, and he has tried these ascetic disciplines in his own life, and he has discovered what works, what doesn't work, and what works well, and what the finer points of how to make it work better. You could say, well, when your priest tells you to do something in that area, in the area of ascetics, you probably want to pay attention and maybe listen to those finer points and give it a try and see, and maybe then if it doesn't work, go back to your priest and say, look, here's what I tried, here's what didn't work. What else should I do? I'll give you another example. Like if your priest is a car mechanic and your car is sputtering, and you go to your priest and say, listen, I don't know what's going on. Can you listen to my car and maybe give me some idea? And he listens to your car and says, yeah, well, your fuel filter needs to be replaced because it's clogged. It's just dirty. Yeah, it's still working, sort of, but it's sputtering. And you say, okay, that makes sense. Well, let's just say your priest is a violinist, and you are trying to play a violin, and you're not able to figure out how in the world you can play this violin, and you go to your priest and say, okay, well, look, I'm trying this and I'm trying that, and it's just not working. And he says, okay, we'll try this, other thing. And you're like, oh, perfect. Okay, that makes sense. Now let's flip it and say your priest is not a car mechanic. And you go to your priest and you say, well, Father, my car is sputtering. Well, I don't know what to do. What would you expect your priest to say? Well, your priest might say, well, my child, may God bless you and your car and everything else about you. Fine, but you still need to find a car mechanic, right? Or let's just say your priest is not a violinist, and you go to your priest and say, Father, I've been playing my violin, and my violin is just not sounding perfect or the way I want it. And your priest says, I will pray for you. Well, that's very nice. But your priest does not know how to help you with your violin. And so I think that when it comes to fasting, it's very similar. So when you say, I go to my priest and my priest says, well, just don't eat, steaks. Well, good. Yeah. I mean, that's generic enough. But I think what we're talking about is your priest probably, unless your priest is a practicing ascetic, someone who practices the discipline of asceticism, your priest probably cannot really help you beyond that. Okay, so don't eat steaks. Okay, good enough. But for the most part, what we're talking about here is a very practical discipline. You either know how to do it, you've done it, you've tried it, you've failed, you've corrected some things, you've figured some things out, you've tried it again, you've learned it from people who have tried, or else you just don't know what you're talking about. You really don't. And so you're just looking at the same online calendar that says, oh, well, no wine, no oil. Okay, well, so then somebody comes to you and you say, okay, no wine, no oil. Just, I don't know, eat whatever else. It's just that simple. I'm sorry to say that, but it's just that simple.
Hmm. It's I guess it's a deep question, and I guess we don't have forever to talk about it, but so this could be talked about for a long. We could just go on and on, I imagine, but to respect your time, I have some questions here that I would like to ask you that maybe we can, respecting your time, we can maybe move through some of these quickly. So, let's say you are you have a spiritual child, or you're working as a priest, and you have someone who is a vegan. This is my question is, this person is always eating a vegan diet. So how would you advise a vegan so that they actually are fasting during a fasting period? And like, how would you give advice to that person?
This is fascinating because I was just thinking about that very recently. Again, you have very good questions. Um, it's a very interesting thing because it really bridges the traditional Christian understanding of fasting against the more modern Western understanding of fasting, right? So the more modern Western thing, and let's just call it post-Vatican II, but it's a very bad description, but I think it will work for this purpose. Is okay. Well, you can give up chocolate, or you can give up coffee, or you can give up something you like, whatever. That has absolutely nothing at all to do with the traditional Christian idea of fasting. So the traditional Christian idea of fasting has nothing to do with whether someone is a vegan. It has to do with whether someone eats or doesn't eat.
Okay.
So if you think about and there's going to be a great degree of difference, and maybe not much uniformity here. But if you think about, I don't know, a typical peasant in Russia in the 18th century, it's someone who ate maybe in an entire year. Let's just call it maybe like 30 pounds of meat a year. That's it. Most of that per person per year. That included infants, and and so for the most part, you're talking about someone who is already a vegan in the first place. So these people, so the idea of giving up meat is not an idea that they would even have in their head at all, because it's like, no, you don't give up meat. Meat is something you have only on the largest feasts. So if you have Pascha, or you have Christmas, or you have some kind of a major, just absolutely magnificent feast, yes, you will slaughter your pig, or your uh, maybe a lamb, or something. But meat is not something you eat every day. It's just not, the idea of giving up meat for Lent is not an idea that even appears in the mind of the people of that time period. So it's like, no, you don't give up meat for Lent. You're hoping that maybe if you're lucky, you will have a piece of meat for Pascha. Maybe. That is the idea. The fact that you can't have meat in the first week of Lent, that's not an idea that even enters the mind.
So this is kind of the way we are practicing today. Orthodox Christians in our country is different than it was practiced. Fasting was practiced in past centuries.
Well, so I'm not entirely sure that. Well, again, this is the problem, is when you say, well, the way we are practicing it, I'm not sure that we can actually say that we have a good representation of who practices what. You can say how you practice it. Maybe I can tell you how I practice it. We can maybe talk about some people who may have disclosed it somehow in the public forum, but the problem is that we were trying to be so shy about it that we don't really talk about it so much. We don't know who does what.
But
And
in general, you can say that in general, people just basically switch to a vegan diet. That's basically what people are doing today.
in general, you can say that this is what's expected, maybe.
Okay.
I don't know that that's what everybody does. Sure. I would have to. I would have to agree that maybe at the very least, if we're talking about like, okay, what is the very least thing that you would ever do for Lent? Well, at the very least, maybe you would give up meat. Okay, sure, that sounds plausible. But again, we're talking about some hypothetical. Like, so what are we talking about? So some hypothetical Orthodox Christian somewhere in America, somewhere of some tradition, and I'm not convinced that it's a productive, really, exercise to talk about some hypothetical Orthodox Christian who hypothetically becomes a vegan. I'm not really sure that it makes a lot of sense to me.
Interesting. What about someone who, so today you've probably heard of this. What about there are people who are using carnivore diets to treat various illnesses, for example, autoimmune disorders. So they only eat meat.
Yes. Well, carnivore, I think they also can have eggs and
Yeah,
like
basically
butter and
animal
stuff.
products.
Yeah.
I guess
Yeah, right.
if a person is a carnivore, well, I guess I keep falling into this trap of, types of kinds of foods that you're trying to avoid. You're trying to get back to this idea of actually fasting. Like,
That's right. Yes.
So I guess, would you encourage, let's say if you were to give people advice, would you encourage people to practice actually fasting? Don't eat one meal a day. Don't eat anything. Or how would would you give advice for that kind of thing?
So I would have to say that excuse me. So I would have to say that first things first. Before you can deal with a carnivore diet, you really need to start fasting first. And to me, fasting means abstinence.
Okay, got it.
If you're gonna get into the modern health craze stuff, okay, let's just call it intermittent fasting. Start with that first. So before you start giving up the meat and the eggs and the yogurt and whatever else, why don't you try just giving up food for a while and see how that goes for you? You know what? Just stop eating. Just stop eating. Because what precisely is the point of saying, "Oh, I'm fasting, but I just ate a vegan cake, an entire cake, or a gallon of vegan ice cream, like Rice Dream or Almond Dream or whatever it is." Let's just say, I'm such a follower of orthodoxy. I fast for great land, and it's great land, and you Catholics are being such heretics because you don't start fasting until Wednesday. But guess what? On Tuesday, I had nothing but a gallon of rice ice cream. Okay, well, good for you, I suppose. But it's like first things first. So you wanna fast. Okay, start with actually fasting, and then let's see how that goes for you. Now, the next level is going to be like, okay, after I have fasted, how do I break my fast? And now we get into the typical. Okay? So the typical will say, okay, on day one, well, you don't break your fast. On day two, you don't break your fast. But if you're so sick and weak and old and whatever, then you could have a piece of bread and a cup of water. Okay, fine. So the typicons are not telling you what not to eat. The typicons are telling you what to eat, So it's a very different thing. So we often misunderstand the rules of the Orthodox Church. It's like, well, what is it that we can't have? No, the Typicons don't tell you what you can't have. There's only one singular thing, strangely, in the Typicon that it says, well, this you will not have, and that is fish. It says, on this, Sunday, whatever, we will eat beans, bread, blah, 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 but not fish. It doesn't say, but not butter, but not steak, but not, chicken, but it says, but not fish. That is the only singular thing it ever tells you not to have. Now, it doesn't tell you, actually, it tells a monk. Because then it says, and if a monk spoils his Lent by eating fish, blah, 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 whatever it is. And then you ask yourself, well, I'm not a monk. Okay. Well, so it's not even talking to you. But yes, we misunderstand the Typicon. We think the Typicon is, proscriptive, but it's actually not. It's prescriptive.
Interesting.
It tells us what to do. It doesn't tell us what not to do. And so that's something that I think is very important to keep in mind when we're talking about fasting. You said, well, what someone has this peculiar diet. I had this question in the past in relation to people that were exercising, right? People who were into various modes of sports, and some people say, well, look, I'm trying to become a bodybuilder, and so I want to grow muscle, and so I want to eat all this protein and whatnot. And here's the trouble with it, is if you happen to have someone in your parish who is actually a professional bodybuilder, whose livelihood it is to grow meat on his arms and legs, well, it's going to be very rare. It's just a rare occasion, and this is not a rule that needs to be promulgated for everybody at all times, right? Most of the time when men say, I'm a bodybuilder, what men mean is, look, I do some pull-ups and sit-ups, but yeah, certainly I'm not a bodybuilder. I hope, or I wish my wife saw me that way, but I'm certainly not a bodybuilder. Okay, whatever. And so I think that's what it is. So if you think you really have to be on a carnivore diet, okay, fine. Maybe you do. Maybe that's the healthiest thing for you. Well, then maybe you need to think about fasting in the most primitive carnivore way of fasting. If you're a carnivore, well, are you really guaranteed to catch an antelope every single day of your life? Well, no. Well, so maybe you're just going to fast for a week before you catch the next antelope. Be the carnivore. Just be the real carnivore. Don't pretend that you're just going to be, catching antelope and bison and whatever else every single day of your life, 3 times a day. Do some fasting. Fast. Fasting is not about what you eat; it's about whether you eat.
Wow, that's a great. I think that's a great thing to end on right there. Fasting is not about what you eat, but whether you eat. So to close this out, I guess this is my final question, which I ask when I bring clergy onto my channel. Would you like to leave us with a word of advice?
Yeah, you know, I do not pretend to give anybody um, advice, uh, but I think this is important, and this is what we just, finished off with is uh, when you when you think about fasting, try not to be a Pharisee. Don't worry about the list of ingredients on the side of whatever it is that you're buying or eating or whatever. Often we just get completely misguided by whether, oh well, is there any milk, is there any egg, is there any byproduct, blah blah blah. It, that is that that is not fasting. That is not that is absolutely not fasting. That's just being a Pharisee. And I'm not saying Pharisee in a bad way. Pharisees were very good people from everything I can read in the Gospels. They were apparently very good people, so I don't want to denigrate them in any way. But don't be a Pharisee when you fast. You either fast or you don't. And so, if you fast, just fast. Just be simple about it. Just simply fast. And if you're not going to fast, then just tell yourself, I'm not going to fast. And don't sit there staring at the lists of ingredients and the little minutia and is maltodextrin this or like I don't know what that even means. I don't think anybody should. I don't think anybody should know what it means. Um, just don't bother with it. You either fast or you don't fast, and I think that is my only piece of advice is that I've discovered for myself. Again, this is advice to myself, right? I wouldn't pretend to give advice to anybody else. To myself, you either fast or you don't, and you know it, and you know it. So just be honest with yourself.
That's great. This is good. I've learned so much talking to you. I thank you for making yourself available for me for this. I will be publishing this video shortly on my YouTube channel. Is there if people wanted to reach out to you or get in contact, or do you have anything else you would like to say before we go, like how they could find you or anything like that?
They can always send me a message on the Substack.
All right. All right. Well, then we have been speaking with Father Sergei Sveshnikov on the topic of the history of fasting, and we thank you all for joining us, and we will catch you on the next one. Good night.